My name is Willa Farrell, and the final word my father ever spoke to me was simple. Go! I was only 11 years old. I stood in the gravel driveway with a worn duffel bag in my hand while my aunt's headlights stretched across the yard. My father never looked back. He never turned around. For the next 20 years, I believed that was the moment he threw me away, as easily as someone discarding a worn-out feed sack. That belief shaped my entire life. I moved 3 states away and built a life where I never had to depend on anyone. I made sure of it. Then last August, while I was halfway through my first real vacation in nearly a decade, my phone lit up where it rested on my beach towel. The message was short. Fly home. Don't tell your parents. I almost laughed. As far as I was concerned, those people had stopped being my parents the day they sent me away. Then another message appeared. Contained 2 names. The moment I read them, it felt as if the ground disappeared beneath me. I booked the first flight home that same night. When I stepped off the plane, a lawyer and 2 police officers were already waiting at my gate. What they told me knocked every certainty out of my life. The cruelest thing I had spent 20 years blaming my father for turned out to be the greatest act of love he had ever shown me. And what my mother did afterward is still something I struggle to talk about without my hands trembling. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, where the quietest member of the family is often the one carrying the biggest truth. If you've ever lived with a story about yourself that someone else wrote for you, and never had the chance to correct it, stay with me. Leave a comment, subscribe, and let's begin. But first, you should know who I was before everything changed. I'm 31 years old and work as a large animal veterinarian just outside Bozeman, Montana. That means most of my workday actually begins while everyone else is still asleep. More often than not, I'm standing inside a freezing barn at 3 o'clock in the morning trying to save an animal before sunrise. The night before everything changed, I had one arm inside a frightened cow named Pickle, trying to turn a calf that had entered the birth canal sideways. The rancher stood nearby in tears. His wife prayed quietly under her breath. Within nearly 40 meters, I was the only person who wasn't panicking. That's usually how my job works. People don't call because everything is fine. They call after the worst has already happened. They need someone willing to stay calm while everyone else falls apart. That's what I've always been good at. Being the steady hands during someone else's hardest moment. Eventually the calf was delivered safely. Took one breath. Then another. Before letting out its first cry, the rancher wrapped me in a grateful hug. I let him hold on for exactly 2 seconds before I stepped back and started cleaning my equipment. Growing up the way I did teaches you something no one ever warns you about. You learn how to be useful. You become the tool people reach for when something breaks. But no one teaches you what it feels like to simply be wanted. By then, I owned a paid-off pickup, had a successful veterinary practice, and lived in a quiet house whose kitchen only needed 1 chair. My Aunt Ruth used to joke that I collected excuses to miss Thanksgiving the same way other women collected family recipes. She wasn't wrong. For 20 years I'd convinced myself I didn't need anyone. Especially not the family who packed my bag when I was 11 and never came looking for me again. I probably would have spent the rest of my life proving that point. If Aunt Ruth hadn't rented a beach house that July and refused to accept no for an answer. Summer in the Outer Banks has its own kind of energy. Children laughing. Families talking over one another. The smell of sunscreen mixing with steamed shrimp drifting across the porch. Ruth's grown children were there, along with their kids racing through the house. Technically, they weren't my immediate family. Ruth was my father's younger sister. When Dad sent me to live with her all those years ago, she could have treated me like an obligation. Instead, she taught me how to drive a tractor. She signed every report card. And years later, when I earned my doctorate, she was sitting proudly in the front row. Her family became the only place that ever truly felt like home. On the 3rd evening of our vacation, one of my little cousins innocently asked when I was finally going to visit the famous Nebraska farm, the one with the red barn hanging in the old photograph on Ruth's wall. The entire porch went quiet. Only for a moment. but long enough for me to notice. Ruth slowly placed her glass of tea on the table. Her expression tightened in a way I'd only seen a handful of times over the years. It was the face of someone trying to hold back a storm. "Don't put ideas like that in her head," she answered far too quickly before changing the conversation to the 4th of July fireworks. I didn't push it. I'd spent most of my life letting unanswered questions stay unanswered. Still. Later that evening, while I dried the dinner dishes, I caught Ruth watching me. Not casually. The way someone watches another person they're afraid is about to discover something they've hidden for years. I convinced myself I was imagining it. I poured a glass of wine and walked toward the sand dunes to watch the sun disappear beneath the horizon. Halfway there, my phone vibrated against my pocket. I assumed it was my answering service. Probably another emergency call. Another ranch. Another family facing the worst night of their lives. Instead, it was a number I didn't recognize. One short message. One sentence. And it destroyed the quiet life I'd spent 20 years building. "Fly home. Don't tell your parents." I read it once. Then again. Then a third time. A cool breeze carried the smell of freshly cut grass from the houses beyond the dunes. In an instant, I was 11 years old again. It's strange how a single scent can drag you backward through time. Back home. It wasn't fresh-cut grass. It was alfalfa. The night they sent me away, the entire farm smelled of freshly cut hay beneath a sky slowly turning purple. I'd come downstairs looking for a glass of water. Instead, I found my mother sitting at the kitchen table with her brother Roy. Spread out before them were stacks of bank statements. Not theirs. My grandmother Nadine's. I wouldn't understand the truth until many years later. The moment Uncle Roy noticed me standing in the doorway, something in his expression hardened. He immediately leaned toward my father, who had just walked in from the fields, and said quietly, "Glenn, the girl saw everything." The color drained from my father's face. No one explained what was happening. Not to an 11-year-old. By sunrise, my duffel bag was already packed. My mother stood on the front porch with her arms folded across her chest as Aunt Ruth's headlights appeared at the end of the lane. I remember looking at her, completely confused. "Why?" I asked. "Why do I have to leave?" She didn't hesitate. She looked me straight in the eyes and spoke the words that shaped the next 20 years of my life. "Your father never wanted you, Willa. Nobody did." Dad was still wearing his old green and black flannel work shirt. He stood beside the truck with his back turned toward me. Called his name. He didn't move. Cried. Still nothing. Even when the screen door slammed so hard behind us that the whole porch rattled. He never turned around. He spoke only one word. "Go." So I did. For the next 20 years I carried those words with me. I believed every sentence my mother had spoken because that's what children do. They believe their mothers. No one, not a single person, ever reached out to tell me a different version of the story. Not once. And now, standing alone in the evening breeze with my phone in my hand, someone finally was. I'm not the kind of woman who follows a stranger's instructions without asking questions. My first instinct wasn't to pack a suitcase. It was to find out who had sent the message. I called the number immediately. It went straight to a generic voicemail with no identifying name. Next, I ran a reverse lookup. The only thing it revealed was an eastern Nebraska area code. Nothing more. I sat down on the cool sand and thought it through the same way I approach a difficult medical case. Whoever sent that text knew my personal cell number. They knew I wasn't home. They even understood that the word parents still carried enough weight to get my attention. That wasn't random. Someone had done their homework. I typed back a simple question. "Who's this?" The reply came almost immediately. "It's about your father. Your mother and Roy cannot know you're coming." The moment I read Roy's name, chill ran through me. Years of therapy had helped me deal with many things. But seeing his name appear in a stranger's message reopened wounds I thought had finally healed. This wasn't a prank. Nobody playing games would know about Roy. I brushed the sand from my jeans and stood up. Inside the beach house, laughter drifted through the screened porch where everyone was gathered around a card game. Aunt Ruth looked up and caught my eye. The second she saw my face, her smile disappeared. I almost told her everything. Almost. But the message had been clear. Don't tell anyone. Something deep inside me, something older than logic, told me to follow that instruction. At least until I understood what was happening. Right there, standing in the darkness, I booked the first overnight flight from Norfolk to Omaha. Running away has never been my way of dealing with problems. Whatever waited for me back in Nebraska had been waiting for 20 years. I wasn't about to let someone else decide what I deserved to know about my own life anymore. During the flight, I had hours to think. So I started thinking about the story everyone back home believed. The version of me they'd been told. In the town of Calhoun, Nebraska, people believed I was the troubled daughter, the difficult child, the liar, thief. According to the story, my parents had exhausted every option before finally sending me away to relatives for the sake of the family's peace. I knew that story well. I'd seen it with my own eyes. When I was 19, I returned to town just once. I walked into the local feed store and watched grown adults quietly move into different aisles rather than acknowledge me. I didn't argue with anyone. There was no point. I'd already learned one important lesson. You can't convince someone to abandon a story they've accepted because believing it is easier than questioning it. So I stopped trying. Instead, I built a different life. One they couldn't take away from me. I paid my own way through college. I earned my degree. Over time, I built a reputation across 3 counties as the veterinarian people trusted when everything else had gone wrong. Reliable hands, honest work, fair prices. If the town wanted to keep believing their version of me, they could. I'd already written a better story for myself. What I didn't know, as I sipped stale airport coffee during my layover in the middle of the night, was what was actually waiting for me back home. The Farrell farm stretched across nearly 400 acres of river-bottom land. Our family had owned it since 1911. After my grandfather died, my grandmother Nadine controlled every financial decision. She'd passed away 3 years earlier. No one had even bothered to tell me she'd died. Somewhere back in Nebraska, there was a Willa farm, a barn full of memories, and an inheritance that had already been divided. Somehow, a lawyer believed it was important enough to send 2 police officers to meet me at the airport. That thought stayed with me the entire flight. I'll be honest with you, even then, I still wasn't sure I trusted the anonymous person texting me. Before I allowed anyone else to shape my next move, I wanted proof. The moment I landed in Omaha just after 6 that morning, I pulled out my phone and dialed the farmhouse number I'd memorized as a little girl. I'd never called it once in 20 years. Rang. Once. 3 times. Then 4. Finally, the answering machine picked up. The voice greeting callers belonged to my mother. Older now. Flatter. Almost unfamiliar. She instructed callers to leave a message for Brenda and Roy at the Farrell residence. The moment I heard Roy's name spoken beside hers, I realized something had changed while I'd been gone. And whatever that change was, it was waiting for me. The fact that Roy was now living in my grandmother's house told me more than the anonymous text ever could. I ended the call before the voicemail beeped. If my mother and Uncle Roy were running the farm together, and someone connected to the authorities wanted me back without them knowing, then the warning wasn't an overreaction. It was a plan. Throughout my career, I'd learned to recognize danger long before it became obvious. A frightened cow moments before it kicks. A rancher standing on the edge of losing everything. You develop an instinct for trouble before anyone else notices it. And every instinct I had told me this situation was heading somewhere bad. I squared my shoulders, picked up my bag, and headed toward baggage claim. A man in a gray suit stood near the exit holding a thick folder against his chest while carefully scanning every face that walked past. 2 officers waited several steps behind him. Professional. Patient. The moment he saw me, he walked straight over. Miss Farrell. He already knew exactly who I was. That meant he'd seen my photograph. This meeting had been arranged well before my plane landed. His voice carried the careful kindness people use when they know they're about to change someone's life. I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances. I'd already flown nearly 2,000 miles because of a text from a stranger. I wasn't willing to spend another minute without answers. The man's name was Tom Beck. He explained that he'd served as my father's attorney for the last 19 years. I had never heard his name before. The two officers accompanying him were investigators from the county attorney's office. He introduced them so casually that, for a moment, the word investigators barely registered. They led me into a small airport office with glass walls. The room looked temporary. A fake plant sat in one corner. A clock on the wall ticked far louder than it should have. Tom placed his folder carefully on the table, then folded his hands across it. He looked like a man about to deliver words he'd rehearsed countless times, and still dreaded saying. Before opening the folder, he looked directly at me. I need you to understand one thing before we go any further. He paused. Your father never abandoned you, Miss Farrell. I didn't move. For 20 years, I'd carried one belief inside me. One sentence. One memory. And with a single statement. He had cracked it wide open. I asked quietly, "What do you mean?" Keeping my voice steady has always been my way of surviving difficult moments. Tom slowly opened the folder. The first thing inside wasn't a legal document. It was an envelope, cream-colored. Its edges were worn from years of careful handling. Across the front, written in handwriting I hadn't seen since childhood, but would have recognized anywhere, was my name, Willa. My father's handwriting hadn't changed. He still pressed the pen so firmly into the paper that the ink nearly carved through it. He always wrote that way, as if the words might disappear unless he forced them to stay. Tom gently slid the envelope across the table toward me. I stared at it, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Silence filled the room. The clock kept ticking. One of the investigators shifted slightly in her chair. Then Tom spoke again. His voice was soft, almost apologetic. Your father passed away 6 days ago. He left everything to you. And 20 years ago, he sent you away to protect you. I barely heard anything after the word protect. The next thing I remember was the floor rushing toward me. I've spent my entire career delivering heartbreaking news to grieving families. In barns, in kitchens, in hospital waiting rooms. I've always been the calm one, the steady one, the person who never falls apart. That day, I did. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't scream. My knees simply gave out beneath me. The room spun. The gray carpet rushed upward. For several seconds, everything disappeared into a blur of white noise. I want to make something clear. I didn't collapse because I was weak. I'd been awake all night. I'd crossed the country on almost no food and too much coffee. Then someone told me the father I'd spent 20 years believing had rejected me had actually been protecting me all along. And now he was gone forever. That isn't weakness. That's grief arriving faster than the heart can understand. When I opened my eyes again, one of the investigators was kneeling beside me with a small paper cup of water. She kept repeating my name. Tom Beck looked devastated. I gently pushed the water aside, braced myself against the wall, and sat up on my own. First time that's ever happened, I muttered, my voice rough but steady. My patients would never let me forget it. No one smiled. And honestly, I didn't expect them to. I took several slow breaths until the room stopped spinning. Then I did the only thing I've ever known how to do when everything around me is collapsing. I searched for the next undeniable fact. I don't need water, I said. I don't need anyone helping me. I need the truth. I looked directly at Tom. Show me the file. Start from the beginning. And don't leave anything out. I've had 20 years of half-truths. I'm ready for the whole story. Tom nodded slowly. He poured himself the water I'd refused before speaking again. Then he explained the mysterious text that had brought me home. It had come from him. The phone was a disposable burner he had purchased specifically for contacting me. The warning about my parents wasn't meant to sound mysterious. It was completely real. My mother, Brenda, and my uncle Roy were both the subjects of an active investigation. If either of them discovered I had returned before everything was ready, the careful plan my father had spent 2 decades putting together could collapse overnight. Money could disappear. Records could be destroyed. Witnesses could be pressured into changing their stories. Tom paused before choosing his next words carefully. Roy has a long history of convincing people to reconsider what they've already said. The room fell silent again. For the first time since boarding that plane, I realized this wasn't just about family. It was about something much bigger. And my father had spent 20 years preparing for this moment.
The investigators didn't disagree with Tom. I asked the question that had been sitting in my mind. An investigation into what? Tom glanced toward the officers before Detective Pruitt answered. Financial exploitation of an elderly person, she said. Your grandmother, Nadine Farrell. For a moment, it felt like the ground shifted beneath me, but I forced myself to stay steady. Grandma Nadine had been the one adult who always made me feel loved. She slipped peppermints into my hand during church and let me name every barn cat on the farm. They drained her finances, Detective Pruitt said plainly. Over several years. Powers of attorney, bank accounts, forged signatures. We've known pieces of the story for a long time, but not the whole picture. I looked down at the folder, then at the envelope with my father's handwriting. Something inside me, something that had stayed buried for 20 years, slowly began to wake up. I didn't cry. There would be time for that later. Not here. Not in front of strangers. Keep going, I said. You told me my father knew. How long had he known? Tom and Detective Pruitt exchanged a look. I knew I wasn't going to like the answer. Tom spread several documents across the table. I read them the way I read medical charts, carefully, searching for the detail that didn't belong. There were years of withdrawals from Grandma Nadine's accounts. A power of attorney signed after her eyesight began failing, naming Roy first and my mother second. Transfer after transfer. Always in amounts small enough to avoid drawing attention. More than $200,000 had quietly disappeared into accounts controlled by my mother and Uncle Roy. I stayed calm by focusing on the facts. Then one line stopped me cold. A withdrawal for $12,000. June 18th. The summer I was 11. I knew that date without looking at a calendar. Detective, I said quietly, June 18th. That was my grandmother's birthday. We were all at the house that night. I came downstairs and saw my mother and Roy sitting at the kitchen table with her bank papers. Roy looked at my father and said, "The girls saw." The next morning I was sent away. Detective Pruitt froze. She pulled the paper closer. How long have you had this record? I asked. About a year, she admitted. You had the date and the withdrawal, I replied. But you didn't have the only witness who was standing in that kitchen. For the first time, they stopped looking at me as someone grieving. Now they saw me as the missing witness who could explain why everything happened. The bank records proved the money. I could explain the timing. And why an 11-year-old girl was suddenly sent 3 states away. Tom closed his eyes for a moment. Your father knew, he said quietly. He suspected it before you were 11. But he couldn't prove it. And he couldn't protect you while fighting them at the same time. I'd like to tell you I immediately felt grateful. I didn't. I got angry. Not emotional anger. Clear, focused anger. If he knew, I said, then answer this. He believed I was in danger from his own wife. So why did he send me away and stay silent for 20 years? No letters. No birthday calls. He let me grow up believing he never wanted me. So what was I? His daughter. Or just a problem he hid 3 states away while he waited for the right moment? The investigators looked down at the table. Tom didn't. It was obvious he'd expected that question. "Your father told me you'd ask exactly that," he said. "He told me, Willa is too smart to be convinced by a sad story. Don't even try." Then he touched the envelope lying between us. "There's a letter." He wrote it over many years and finished it this spring, after learning his heart was failing. He left strict instructions. You are not to receive it or any of these documents until after he was gone, and everything was in place to keep you safe. Not one day earlier. Tom's voice faltered for just a moment. He told me, "If she reads that letter while I'm still alive, I'll lose my nerve and destroy 20 years of work. If I ever see my little girl's face again," he had written, "I'll tell her everything and forget the consequences." I sat there with my jaw clenched. I wasn't ready to believe the words of a man who was already gone. But I wanted to read that letter more than anything. Then Tom told me something that broke me even further. Aunt Ruth was already on her way to Omaha. The moment I had replied to his text, Tom had called her. She'd boarded a flight just an hour after mine. She had known the entire time we were sitting together on that beach porch, and she hadn't said a single word. When Ruth finally walked into the airport office, 60 years old, gray-haired, and visibly shaking, I stood so quickly my chair scraped across the floor. "You knew," I said. It wasn't a question. She nodded without looking away. "I did." She took a slow breath. "The week before Glenn put you in my car, he came to me. He told me everything Brenda and Roy were doing. And he made me swear, on our mother's memory, that I would never tell you the real reason. He believed if you knew the truth, you'd come back to fix it, because that's who you are. And they would silence you to protect themselves. He said the only way to keep you safe was to make sure you never wanted anything to do with that farm again." She paused before continuing. "He tried to reach you once. That first Christmas, he couldn't bear the silence. He gave me a Christmas card with nothing inside except his signature and asked me to mail it. 2 weeks later, Roy stopped Glenn near the grain bins. He casually mentioned what a shame it was that little Willa was all the way out at Ruth's place. He even said your name." Ruth looked down. "Your father had never told anyone where you were except me. That was when he realized they were watching both our mail. He never tried to contact you again. Not because he stopped loving you. Because he knew they were still watching." She wiped away a tear. "I let you believe that lie for 20 years, Willa. And I've hated myself every day because of it." Then she placed a plain cardboard storage box on the table. The edges were sealed with old tape. Resting on top, carefully folded, was my father's green and black work flannel. The same one he'd been wearing the morning he sent me away. I hadn't seen it in 20 years. But I would have recognized it anywhere. "He wanted you to have this," Ruth whispered. "He told me. When she opens it, make sure she's alone. She'll need to be." I gently rested my hand on the flannel. Somehow, it still carried the faint scent of him. I checked into a small motel near the interstate, locked the door, then sat on the floor with my back against the bed, just like I used to when I was a frightened child. Inside the box were only 2 things: a thick binder and the cream-colored envelope with my name written across the front. I opened the letter first. It stretched across 12 handwritten pages. Some sections had been written years apart. Near the beginning, the handwriting was firm and familiar. Toward the end, his writing had become weaker, shakier. He wrote about the night I came downstairs. He explained that Roy had openly threatened to make sure the girl forgets what she thinks she saw. At that moment, my father realized he couldn't protect me and expose them at the same time. So he made the hardest choice of his life. He sent me somewhere they couldn't reach me, while spending the next 20 years quietly gathering the evidence needed to stop them. Near the bottom of the first page was one sentence I've read so many times I know it by heart. "I had to let you hate me, so you could stay alive." Then I opened the binder. It wasn't filled with memories. It was filled with proof. Certified bank records, court documents, property filings, copies of legal transfers. Everything carefully preserved. There were bank statements obtained through a guardianship case. A transfer on death deed for all 400 acres, officially recorded in 2019. With my name listed as the beneficiary. Letters exchanged with Detective Pruitt's office over the previous 2 years. A revocable trust protecting what remained of Grandma Nadine's estate. Again. Everything carried my name. That's when I finally understood. My father hadn't loved me with hugs, or birthday cards, or phone calls. He had loved me through legal filings, through courthouse records, through 20 years of silent sacrifice. He let me believe he hated me, so I could stay alive, sitting alone on that motel floor. I cried harder than I had in years. I read every page. Then I read them all again. The second time through. The night I was 11 finally made sense. The papers on the kitchen table had belonged to Grandma Nadine. I'd walked into the middle of a theft. Roy's words, the girls saw. My father's face turning pale as he realized his daughter had suddenly become a danger to the people stealing from his own mother. He had faced a choice no parent should ever have to make. Keep me close. Or keep me safe. He chose the one that destroyed his own heart, while protecting mine. In the letter, he admitted he never looked back at me beside the truck because he knew he wouldn't be strong enough. If he'd turned around, he would have run to me, taken me back inside, and they would have come after both of us. So he kept his back to me. He let the screen door slam, and forced out the only word he could say without breaking apart. Go. For 20 years. I believed that single word meant he was rejecting me. Now I understood that word differently. For 20 years, I had heard go as rejection. Now I heard it as the hardest expression of love a broken father could give. The letter answered every question I had been throwing at Tom Beck. Why no secret phone calls? Why no hidden letters through Ruth? Why 20 years of silence? My father had considered every possibility and explained why none of them were safe. Roy watched everything. He monitored Nadine's mail and paid close attention to the family. One card from a father who was supposedly estranged from his daughter would have told them something important. I still mattered to him. And if they knew that, they might come looking for me. A real separation was the only story that could survive that level of scrutiny, because it wasn't pretending. It looked real. Reading the letter, I finally understood what Roy had wanted all those years. Not revenge. Not a chase. Just silence. Every careful thief wants the same thing. No attention. A missing girl brings questions. A frightened girl brings even more. And the last thing Roy and my mother needed was someone asking where Nadine's granddaughter had gone. So Roy needed me gone. And quiet. Nothing more. For 20 years, I gave him exactly that. The danger had never been someone hunting me down. The danger was the truth. And that danger only returned if I came back, or started asking questions, or told someone what I'd seen. His comment near the grain bins all those years ago hadn't been casual. It was a warning. We know where she is. Keep her away, and she'll stay safe. My father understood the message immediately, so he spent 2 decades keeping that door closed. The legal situation was no different. If he had accused Roy and my mother too early, they could have destroyed records, moved money, and buried evidence. He needed proof. He needed patterns. He needed the estate to open. So he waited. He documented everything. In 2019, the first safe opportunity he had, he quietly recorded the deed. Then, he let me continue hating him because a daughter who hates her father doesn't come home and walk into danger. It didn't erase the grief. Nothing could erase the pain of discovering someone loved you only after they were gone. But it changed where my anger belonged. My mother, the woman who looked her crying 11-year-old daughter in the eyes and chose the cruelest lie possible.
And Roy,
the man who made my father fear for my safety. They were only 40 miles south of my motel room, sleeping comfortably in my grandmother's house, counting an inheritance they already believed belonged to them. And they had absolutely no idea I was back. The next morning, I met Tom Beck at his office. He explained where things stood. My father's funeral had been quick and quiet, exactly the way my mother wanted it, before too many questions could be asked. The will reading was scheduled for Friday, 3 days away. And, of course, Brenda had insisted it happen at the farmhouse, in front of relatives. the pastor, a few longtime neighbors, an audience. My mother had always loved an audience, especially when she could perform grief for one. She fully expected to inherit the 400 acres. She also believed whatever remained of Nadine's estate would belong to her. In fact, she'd already hired her own lawyer and started preparing paperwork based on that assumption. Tom slid another document across the desk. 2 weeks before your father died, he said, your mother convinced him to sign something. She told the notary it was a farm lease renewal. It wasn't. It was a quitclaim deed transferring ownership of the farm to her. I felt my heartbeat quicken, then forced it back under control. Did it work? I asked. For the first time, Tom almost smiled. No. You can't transfer property you no longer own. He tapped the file. Your father recorded the transfer on death deed in 2019. That document became controlling the moment he died. No later deed. No will. No paperwork Brenda produces can override it. He leaned back. She tried to steal a farm that was already yours. The only problem is, she doesn't know it yet. I sat quietly for a moment. I could have returned to Montana, let the attorneys handle everything, stayed far away from that house forever. That would have been safer. But it would also have been smaller. And I have never been built for small. Put me on the list for Friday, I said. I'll be there. Tom studied me carefully. You sure? I nodded. Let her think I came to mourn. I didn't wait until Friday to see them. Wednesday afternoon, I drove back to the farm. The same county road I hadn't traveled since I was 19. The fields were full of freshly cut alfalfa. That familiar sweet smell drifted through the truck windows and carried me straight back to childhood. The house looked different than I remembered. Smaller. Harder. Less like a home. My mother stepped onto the porch before I'd even climbed out of the truck. And suddenly 20 years disappeared. Not in a good way. She had grown older. Still striking. Still composed. Dressed completely in black. Holding her grief like a performance. Brenda Farrell stood on that porch dabbing at eyes that weren't actually crying. Well, my mother said with a thin smile, look who finally decided to come back. Roy stepped onto the porch behind her. Older. Heavier. But those cold, emotionless eyes hadn't changed at all. My half-brother Travis was there too. He was 27 now, a grown man I'd barely known because he'd grown up believing I was the family's problem child. I calmly told my mother I had returned to attend my father's funeral and pay my respects. I watched her study me for a moment before deciding I wasn't a threat. Her expression softened into something even worse than anger. Pity. Honey, she said, you traveled all this way for a man who sent you away and never cared enough to look back. Then, because cruelty came as naturally to her as breathing, she repeated the same lie she'd told me 20 years earlier on that very porch. Your father didn't want you, Willa. Nobody did. I stood there, surrounded by the familiar scent of fresh alfalfa, knowing the truth was sitting inside the binder in my truck. But I didn't say a word. I simply looked at her with the calm stillness of frozen water. Come Friday, she said, listen to the will, then head back to your animals. I wouldn't miss it, I replied. As I walked toward my truck, Travis followed me. He looked nervous. Like someone who'd been promised everything and suddenly wasn't so sure anymore. You really shouldn't have come, he said quietly. There was no anger in his voice. Only anxiety. Mom and Roy already have everything settled. The farm. Grandma's money. Everything. There are papers. What papers? I asked. Completely confident, he repeated exactly what he'd been told. Dad signed the farm over to Mom 2 weeks before he died. A lawyer in Fremont handled it. It's airtight. I kept my expression neutral. So this was the quitclaim deed Tom Beck had warned me about. My mother wasn't pretending she had won. She genuinely believed she already had. That was useful. People who think victory is guaranteed usually stop being careful. They say things they'd never admit otherwise. I asked Travis one more question. Did you ever actually see me steal anything? Or lie the way Mom always said I did? He hesitated, then blinked. No. I was pretty little. I only know what she told me. After a pause, he quietly added, "She told me a lot of things." Then he stopped talking. It sounded like a man hearing his own beliefs from someone else's perspective for the first time. I didn't push him. Some truths grow better when you leave them alone. You plant the seed, and let time do the rest. I told him I'd see him Friday. Then I drove back toward town with the windows down. For the first time since receiving that text on the beach, I felt something besides grief. I felt focus. The same calm concentration I feel before a difficult surgery, when I already know exactly where the problem is and exactly how to deal with it. I'm not going to pretend the outcome was guaranteed. That afternoon, Tom Beck carefully explained both my strengths and my risks. False hope, he said, only delays disappointment. The evidence in my favor was solid. The recorded transfer on death deed legally transferred the 400 acres to me the moment my father passed away. It took priority over both the will and my mother's quitclaim deed. The trust protecting what remained of Grandma Nadine's estate also listed me as the beneficiary. These weren't promises. They were official legal documents. Filed. Recorded. Time-stamped. All completed back in 2019, years before my mother tried to claim the property. Still, Tom made sure I understood something important. Strong evidence doesn't mean an easy victory. Your mother can still challenge the deed, he explained. If she convinces a judge that your father lacked mental capacity in 2019, or that someone improperly influenced him, the case could become complicated. Tom didn't believe those arguments would succeed. My father had documented everything while he was healthy and fully competent. But courtrooms don't run on certainty. They run on evidence. And judges are human. There was another complication. As Glenn's surviving wife, my mother still had legal rights under Nebraska law to claim an elective share of his estate. She couldn't simply be left with nothing. There were also 2 joint bank accounts that would automatically become hers. Tom looked me in the eye. She'll fight. She'll hire experienced lawyers. And she'll try to make this as slow, expensive, and painful as possible. But the land, he tapped the deed, stands on the strongest legal foundation your father could have given it. Then he added one final reminder. The strongest foundation isn't the same as a guaranteed victory. He believed we'd ultimately win. He simply refused to promise it would be quick or easy. My father hadn't ended the battle before it began. He had only made sure I entered it with the best chance possible. My father hadn't won the battle for me. He had simply placed the strongest possible hand in mine. Now it was my turn to play it. He hadn't relied on dramatic speeches or grand gestures. Instead, he'd spent years filing ordinary legal documents. Because when everything else falls apart, it's the paperwork that survives. I asked Tom Beck whether my mother knew the farm had already slipped out of her hands. He shook his head. No, he said. She believes Friday will be her victory. I pictured her in a black dress, practicing her performance of grief, completely convinced she was about to inherit everything. I decided not to ruin that confidence a moment sooner than necessary. Thursday evening, Roy found me standing behind the equipment shed. I'd walked over to look at the old hay rake my father used to let me ride as a child. I heard his boots crunch across the gravel before I saw him. The same feeling I'd experienced at 11 crept up the back of my neck. He stopped only a step away. Too close. Close enough to remind me he wanted me to feel intimidated. You're stirring up trouble, he said. I can see it. I'm only here for my father's funeral, I answered. He smiled. There wasn't a trace of kindness in it. Here's a little family advice, he said. This family has a way of swallowing people who come back. Glenn learned when to stay quiet. You should do the same. Get back on a plane. 20 years earlier, that voice had helped send me away. Standing there at 31. I finally understood exactly what my father had feared all those years. I didn't step backward, but I also didn't pretend I was stronger than I was. Instead, I calmly stepped sideways, putting space between us. Then I looked at my watch and spoke loudly enough for him to hear. Thursday, 5:41. You've just threatened me behind the equipment shed. I'm a witness in an active investigation, Roy. From this moment forward, everything you say becomes part of my statement. He froze. Both of us felt the shift. For years, his power had come from fear. Mine now came from evidence. He could still threaten me with his presence. I could answer with a date, a time, and the phone number of a detective. Those aren't equal weapons. Mine doesn't lose its strength. Before I even left the driveway, I called Detective Pruitt and reported the encounter. She told me the investigation had progressed much further than anyone at the farmhouse realized. The bank had officially flagged the suspicious transactions. The guardianship case my father started had become part of the evidence. And my memory of the June 18th withdrawal, tied directly to the night I was sent away, had given investigators the missing piece. The financial records proved the theft. My testimony explained why it happened. That turned numbers on a spreadsheet into a story a jury could understand. Meanwhile, Brenda and Roy still believed they were preparing for nothing more than a routine reading of the will. They had no idea the county attorney was reviewing the very same evidence I had just read. That night, Travis called me. His voice sounded unusually small. He asked only one question. "Did Dad really write you a letter?" "Yes," I answered. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he quietly asked, "What did it say?" I read him 3 short lines. The part where our father explained why he never turned around that morning. On the other end of the phone, I heard my brother's breathing change. The way a grown man breathes when he's trying not to cry. He didn't apologize. He didn't suddenly take my side. But something inside him shifted. I left it alone. Because truth doesn't need force. It only needs the chance to be heard. Later that evening, I met with Tom Beck one last time. I explained exactly how I wanted Friday to unfold. I wasn't going to sit quietly while someone else settled the biggest moment of my life. Most people would have let the lawyer begin by presenting the deed. I wanted something different. I wanted the lies and the truth, standing in the same room together. I looked at Tom and said, "Don't start with the deed. Let my mother take control first. Let her tell everyone the story she's been repeating for 20 years. Let her say that Dad sent me away because I was a liar. Let her call herself the faithful widow who deserves everything. Let her say it all, in front of the pastor, the neighbors, and every witness in that room." Then, I looked at the folder. After she's committed herself to every lie. "Open it." Tom Beck studied me silently for a long moment. My father hadn't won the battle for me. He had simply placed the strongest possible hand in mine. Now it was my turn to play it. He hadn't relied on dramatic speeches or grand gestures. Instead, he'd spent years filing ordinary legal documents. Because when everything else falls apart, it's the paperwork that survives. I asked Tom Beck whether my mother knew the farm had already slipped out of her hands.
He shook his head. "No," he said.
She believes Friday will be her victory. I pictured her in a black dress, practicing her performance of grief, completely convinced she was about to inherit everything. I decided not to ruin that confidence a moment sooner than necessary. Thursday evening, Roy found me standing behind the equipment shed. I'd walked over to look at the old hay rake my father used to let me ride as a child. I heard his boots crunch across the gravel before I saw him. The same feeling I'd experienced at 11 crept up the back of my neck. He stopped only a step away. Too close. Close enough to remind me he wanted me to feel intimidated. "You're stirring up trouble," he said. "I can see it." "I'm only here for my father's funeral," I answered. He smiled. There wasn't a trace of kindness in it. "Here's a little family advice," he said. "This family has a way of swallowing people who come back. Glenn learned when to stay quiet. You should do the same. Get back on a plane." 20 years earlier, that voice had helped send me away. Standing there at 31, I finally understood exactly what my father had feared all those years. I didn't step backward, but I also didn't pretend I was stronger than I was. Instead, I calmly stepped sideways, putting space between us. Then I looked at my watch and spoke loudly enough for him to hear. "Thursday, 5:41. You've just threatened me behind the equipment shed. I'm a witness in an active investigation, Roy. From this moment forward, everything you say becomes part of my statement." He froze. Both of us felt the shift. For years, his power had come from fear. Mine now came from evidence. He could still threaten me with his presence. I could answer with a date, a time, and the phone number of a detective. Those aren't equal weapons. Mine doesn't lose its strength. Before I even left the driveway, I called Detective Pruitt and reported the encounter. She told me the investigation had progressed much further than anyone at the farmhouse realized. The bank had officially flagged the suspicious transactions. The guardianship case my father started had become part of the evidence. And my memory of the June 18th withdrawal, tied directly to the night I was sent away, had given investigators the missing piece. The financial records proved the theft. My testimony explained why it happened. That turned numbers on a spreadsheet into a story a jury could understand. Meanwhile, Brenda and Roy still believed they were preparing for nothing more than a routine reading of the will. They had no idea the county attorney was reviewing the very same evidence I had just read. That night, Travis called me. His voice sounded unusually small. He asked only one question. "Did Dad really write you a letter?" "Yes," I answered. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he quietly asked, "What did it say?" I read him 3 short lines. The part where our father explained why he never turned around that morning. On the other end of the phone, I heard my brother's breathing change. The way a grown man breathes when he's trying not to cry. He didn't apologize. He didn't suddenly take my side. But something inside him shifted. I left it alone. Because truth doesn't need force. It only needs the chance to be heard. Later that evening, I met with Tom Beck one last time. I explained exactly how I wanted Friday to unfold. I wasn't going to sit quietly while someone else settled the biggest moment of my life. Most people would have let the lawyer begin by presenting the deed. I wanted something different. I wanted the lies and the truth, standing in the same room together. I looked at Tom and said, "Don't start with the deed. Let my mother take control first. Let her tell everyone the story she's been repeating for 20 years. Let her say that Dad sent me away because I was a liar. Let her call herself the faithful widow who deserves everything. Let her say it all, in front of the pastor, the neighbors, and every witness in that room." Then, I looked at the folder. After she's committed herself to every lie. "Open it." Tom Beck studied me silently for a long moment. My father hadn't won the battle for me. He had simply placed the strongest possible hand in mine. Now it was my turn to play it. He hadn't relied on dramatic speeches or grand gestures. Instead, he'd spent years filing ordinary legal documents. Because when everything else falls apart, it's the paperwork that survives. I asked Tom Beck whether my mother knew the farm had already slipped out of her hands.
He shook his head. "No," he said.
She believes Friday will be her victory. I pictured her in a black dress, practicing her performance of grief, completely convinced she was about to inherit everything. I decided not to ruin that confidence a moment sooner than necessary. Thursday evening, Roy found me standing behind the equipment shed. I'd walked over to look at the old hay rake my father used to let me ride as a child. I heard his boots crunch across the gravel before I saw him. The same feeling I'd experienced at 11 crept up the back of my neck. He stopped only a step away. Too close. Close enough to remind me he wanted me to feel intimidated. "You're stirring up trouble," he said. "I can see it." "I'm only here for my father's funeral," I answered. He smiled. There wasn't a trace of kindness in it. "Here's a little family advice," he said. "This family has a way of swallowing people who come back. Glenn learned when to stay quiet. You should do the same. Get back on a plane." 20 years earlier, that voice had helped send me away. Standing there at 31. I finally understood exactly what my father had feared all those years. I didn't step backward, but I also didn't pretend I was stronger than I was. Instead, I calmly stepped sideways, putting space between us. Then I looked at my watch and spoke loudly enough for him to hear. "Thursday, 5:41. You've just threatened me behind the equipment shed. I'm a witness in an active investigation, Roy. From this moment forward, everything you say becomes part of my statement." He froze. Both of us felt the shift. For years, his power had come from fear. Mine now came from evidence. He could still threaten me with his presence. I could answer with a date, a time, and the phone number of a detective. Those aren't equal weapons. Mine doesn't lose its strength. Before I even left the driveway, I called Detective Pruitt and reported the encounter. She told me the investigation had progressed much further than anyone at the farmhouse realized. The bank had officially flagged the suspicious transactions. The guardianship case my father started had become part of the evidence. And my memory of the June 18th withdrawal, tied directly to the night I was sent away, had given investigators the missing piece. The financial records proved the theft. My testimony explained why it happened. That turned numbers on a spreadsheet into a story a jury could understand. Meanwhile, Brenda and Roy still believed they were preparing for nothing more than a routine reading of the will. They had no idea the county attorney was reviewing the very same evidence I had just read. That night, Travis called me. His voice sounded unusually small. He asked only one question. "Did Dad really write you a letter?" "Yes," I answered. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he quietly asked, "What did it say?" I read him 3 short lines. The part where our father explained why he never turned around that morning. On the other end of the phone, I heard my brother's breathing change. The way a grown man breathes when he's trying not to cry. He didn't apologize. He didn't suddenly take my side, but something inside him shifted. I left it alone, because truth doesn't need force. It only needs the chance to be heard. Later that evening, I met with Tom Beck one last time. I explained exactly how I wanted Friday to unfold. I wasn't going to sit quietly while someone else settled the biggest moment of my life. Most people would have let the lawyer begin by presenting the deed. I wanted something different. I wanted the lies and the truth, standing in the same room together. I looked at Tom and said, "Don't start with the deed. Let my mother take control first. Let her tell everyone the story she's been repeating for 20 years. Let her say that Dad sent me away because I was a liar. Let her call herself the faithful widow who deserves everything. Let her say it all. In front of the pastor, the neighbors, and every witness in that room." Then, I looked at the folder. After she's committed herself to every lie, open it. Tom Beck studied me silently for a long moment.